She walked into the airport like anyone else, confident, prepared, and with a mission to serve her country. But what started as a routine trip quickly turned into a nightmare of assumptions and prejudice. What no one knew, not even the ones who tried to humiliate her, was the shocking truth about her identity. By the end of the day, the tables would turn in a way no one could have imagined. Ready to hear what happened next? The airport hummed with the usual cacophony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried footsteps. Lena Borden stepped into the terminal, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. She exuded quiet confidence, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a crisp white blouse. Her braided hair was neatly tied back, and she carried a leather briefcase that seemed to say she meant business. Lena approached the check-in counter, her eyes scanning the area. She had dealt with her share of travel woes before, but nothing about this trip seemed unusual. She was scheduled to attend an emergency summit in Washington, D.C., and the urgency of her mission gave her no time for distractions. "Good morning," Lena greeted the agent behind the counter, flashing a polite smile. The name tag pinned to his chest read Carl Kennett. He was a man in his late 30s with a sharp jawline and an even sharper demeanor. His gaze flickered to Lena, his initial politeness quickly replaced by something colder. "Ticket and ID," he said curtly, barely looking up. Lena handed over her documents without hesitation, her mind already racing through the agenda for the summit. The president had personally invited her to deliver an address on justice reform, and she had no intention of arriving unprepared. Carl took her documents and examined them with exaggerated scrutiny, his lips pressed into a thin line and his brow furrowed, as if deciphering an ancient riddle. "Is there a problem?" Lena asked, tilting her head slightly. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "This ID doesn't look right." Lena blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." Carl leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it sound menacing. "You heard me. This ID doesn't seem legitimate." A murmur rippled through the passengers behind her. Lena could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others judgmental. The air around her seemed to thicken, but she held her ground. "I assure you, my documents are in order," Lena said, keeping her tone steady. She was no stranger to confrontations, but this one carried an undercurrent of something more insidious. Carl smirked, a smugness creeping into his demeanor. "People try all sorts of tricks to get through security these days. If you don't have proper identification, I can't check you in, simple as that." The murmurs grew louder. Lena could feel the heat of embarrassment rising, but she refused to let it show. She straightened her posture and met Carl's gaze head-on. "With all due respect, I'm on official government business. My paperwork has been cleared through proper channels." Carl's smirk widened, his gaze darting to the line of passengers, now openly watching the exchange. "Government business, right? And I'm the president." A ripple of laughter echoed from a nearby couple. Lena's jaw tightened. She wasn't one to lose her temper, but the blatant disrespect stung. Still, she knew better than to react in anger. "May I speak to your supervisor?" she asked, her voice firm. Carl leaned back, crossing his arms. "Supervisor's busy, but if you insist, I can call security instead. Maybe they'll find your paperwork more convincing." The words hung in the air like a threat. Lena clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was tempted to reveal her position, to pull rank and end this charade, but something held her back. She'd learned long ago that power wasn't just about titles, it was about knowing when to use them. Before she could respond, Carl picked up his phone and muttered something into the receiver. Moments later, two security officers appeared, their expressions stern and unyielding. "This woman's causing a disturbance," Carl said, gesturing toward Lena. "Claims to be on government business, but her paperwork doesn't check out." Lena opened her mouth to protest, but one of the officers cut her off. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us." The world seemed to slow as Lena processed the absurdity of the situation around her. Passengers whispered and pointed, their faces a blur of curiosity and judgment. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let them see her falter. "Very well," she said calmly, picking up her briefcase. "Lead the way." As she followed the officers toward the interrogation room, Lena's mind raced. She wasn't just fighting for herself. This was about something much bigger, something she couldn't ignore. The summit could wait. First, she had a battle to win here. The cold, sterile room reeked of intimidation. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows on the plain gray walls. Lena sat on a metal chair at a small table, her back straight, her briefcase resting on her lap. Across from her stood the two security officers, their stances rigid and their eyes filled with suspicion. One officer, a tall man with a prominent scar on his chin, leaned forward, his knuckles resting on the table. "State your full name," he demanded, his tone clipped. "Lena Borden," she replied evenly, her voice betraying no trace of the irritation boiling inside her. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger man who seemed less sure of himself. The younger officer shuffled his feet, his eyes darting between Lena and the documents in his hand. His discomfort was palpable, but he remained silent. "And your purpose for travel?" the first officer continued. "I'm traveling to Washington, D.C. for official government business," Lena said, her tone unwavering. She had nothing to hide, and she refused to let them rattle her. The older officer raised an eyebrow. "Government business? Care to elaborate?" Lena paused, choosing her words carefully. "I have a meeting with senior officials. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details." The officer snorted, his skepticism blatant. "Not at liberty to discuss? Sounds convenient." Lena leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "I don't believe I'm required to disclose classified information in a non-criminal investigation." Her words seemed to catch him off guard, but he recovered quickly. He straightened, folding his arms across his chest. "You realize withholding information can make you look guilty, right?" "Guilty of what?" Lena asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Traveling while black." The room fell silent. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but the older one's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door swung open. Carl Kennett strode in, his smirk more pronounced than ever. He leaned against the door frame, his arms crossed, as if he were watching a soap opera unfold. "I see we're making progress," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Has she admitted to forging her ID yet?" Lena's patience snapped. She rose to her feet, her movements deliberate and controlled. The officers tensed, but she ignored them, directing her full attention to Carl. "My ID is not forged," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And your baseless accusations are not only unfounded, but deeply inappropriate." Carl's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "Inappropriate? Lady, you're the one making a scene." Lena's eyes narrowed. "I've been calm and cooperative, despite being unjustly detained. But if you're determined to escalate this, I suggest you consider the consequences." Carl chuckled, shaking his head. "Consequences? Please. You think you scare me." The older officer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mr. Kennett, perhaps—" "No," Carl interrupted, waving him off. "I've seen this before. People like her think they can bluff their way out of anything." Lena's lips pressed into a thin line, but she remained composed. She reached into her briefcase, her movements slow and deliberate. The officers instinctively stepped back, their hands hovering near their holsters. Lena froze, raising her hand slightly to show she meant no harm. "I'm retrieving my business card," she said evenly. She pulled out a sleek black card and placed it on the table. The older officer picked it up, his eyes scanning the embossed text. His face went pale. "Attorney General of the United States," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The room froze. Carl's smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. The younger officer's mouth fell open, and even the older officer seemed at a loss for words. Lena crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I trust this clears up any confusion." Carl opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been playing with fire and was about to get burned. The door swung open again, and this time, a woman in a tailored suit stepped in. She exuded authority, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with a single glance. "Miss Borden," she said, her voice firm but respectful. "I'm Sarah Ballman, the airport director. I came as soon as I heard." Lena inclined her head. "Director Ballman." Sarah turned to Carl, her expression icy. "What exactly is going on here?" Carl stammered, his confidence evaporating. Tu was just following protocol. Her paperwork looked suspicious. Suspicious. Sarah's voice rose. "You detained the Attorney General of the United States on suspicion of improper paperwork? Are you out of your mind?" Carl's face turned crimson. He opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Apologize." "Now." Carl hesitated, but the weight of Sarah's authority was undeniable. He turned to Lena, his head hanging low. "I'm sorry." Lena didn't respond. She simply looked at him, her silence more powerful than any words she could have spoken. Sarah turned to the officers. "Escort Miss Borden to her flight immediately." "And you," she said, pointing at Carl. "Report to my office. We'll be having a very serious discussion about your future here." Lena picked up her briefcase, her movements calm and deliberate. As she followed the officers out of the room, she felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. The battle wasn't over, but for now, she had won this round. Outside the interrogation room, passengers stared as she walked by, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and awe. Lena kept her head high, her stride confident. She wasn't just walking to her flight, she was walking toward justice, one step at a time. The hush of first class wrapped around Lena like a cocoon as she settled into her seat by the window. The faint hum of the engines, in preparation for takeoff, was a stark contrast to the chaos she had just endured. She placed her briefcase beneath her seat and exhaled deeply, willing herself to shift focus. The summit awaited her, and her mind needed to be razor-sharp, but the tension in her shoulders refused to ease. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile, breaking her thoughts. "Miss Borden, welcome aboard. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Lena hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "A glass of water, please." As the attendant left, Lena allowed her gaze to drift out of the window. The tarmac shimmered under the afternoon sun, a reminder of the stark contrast between light and shadow, much like the experience she had just endured. She closed her eyes briefly, replaying the events in her mind. The humiliation, the judgmental stares, the condescension in Carl Kennett's voice. It wasn't the first time Lena had encountered prejudice, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time, the stakes had been higher. They hadn't just challenged her identity, they challenged her integrity. That was a line she couldn't allow anyone to cross. The flight attendant returned with her water, and Lena offered a polite smile as she took the glass. As the attendant walked away, a familiar voice interrupted Lena's thoughts. "Miss Borden." Sarah Ballman stood in the aisle, her expression a mix of regret and urgency. Lena gestured to the seat across from her. "Director Ballman, please sit." Sarah sank into the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to speak with you before we take off. First, let me say again how deeply sorry I am for what happened. Carl Kennett's behavior was unacceptable, and I've already begun the process of addressing it." Lena's gaze was steady, unreadable. "Addressing it?" Sarah's face flushed slightly. "He's been suspended pending a formal review. I assure you, there will be consequences." Lena nodded slowly. "Good. But consequences alone won't fix the systemic issues that allow incidents like this to happen in the first place." Sarah's shoulders sagged. "I know, and I'm committed to making changes. I'm implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, and we're revising our procedures to ensure no one is ever treated the way you were." Lena sipped her water, her silence pressing Sarah to continue. "I also want to thank you," Sarah added, her voice soft, "for handling the situation with such grace. I can only imagine how angry you must have been." Lena set her glass down, her fingers tracing its rim. Anger wouldn't have changed the outcome, but action might. Sarah nodded, her respect for Lena evident. "If there's anything more I can do, there is," Lena interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "Use this moment as a lesson, not just for Carl, but for everyone who works under your leadership. Prejudice thrives in complacency. Change requires vigilance." Sarah's expression shifted to one of determination. "You have my word." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their impending departure. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Miss Borden. I'll let you rest now." As Sarah walked away, Lena allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened, but it was a start. As the plane ascended, Lena leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, the hum of the engines lulling her into a meditative state. Her mind wandered back to the summit ahead. The president's invitation had been clear. This was her chance to push for transformative justice reform. But now, her resolve burned brighter. The events at the airport had only reinforced the urgency of her mission. She thought of the people who couldn't fight back, who didn't have the platform or the power to challenge injustice. This fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to them too. The single mother denied housing, the young man racially profiled at a traffic stop, the countless faces behind countless stories. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She hesitated before pulling it out, mindful of the cabin rules, but the notification was worth it. A text from her chief of staff. All eyes on you. The press is already buzzing about the airport incident. Be ready to address it. Lena's jaw tightened. She hadn't planned to bring up the airport debacle at the summit. It felt personal, not political. But maybe there was an opportunity here, a chance to turn a moment of injustice into a broader call for change. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and she typed a quick response. Let's use this. Prepare a statement. She tucked the phone away, her resolve crystallizing. This wasn't just a flight to Washington. It was a flight toward a turning point. The rest of the flight passed in quiet contemplation. When the plane touched down in Washington, D.C., Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. As she exited the aircraft, her steps were steady, her posture commanding. A car awaited her on the tarmac, and the driver opened the door with a respectful nod. Welcome to Washington, Miss Borden. She slid into the back seat, her briefcase resting on her lap. The driver navigated through the city's maze of streets, and Lena stared out the window, the Capitol dome gleaming in the distance. It was a symbol of power, of possibility, but also of responsibility. When the car pulled up to the summit venue, a throng of reporters crowded the entrance. Cameras flashed, and voices called her name. Lena stepped out of the car, her head held high. This wasn't just about her title, her speech, or her ambitions. It was about making her voice echo in the chambers of power and the hearts of those who needed hope. The summit awaited, and Lena was ready to make the world listen. The grand hall of the summit buzzed with energy, a mix of anticipation and tension hanging in the air. Rows of seats were filled with policymakers, activists, journalists, and community leaders, their conversations a steady hum of intellect and determination. At the front of the room stood a podium, its microphone a gateway to influence, illuminated by the soft glow of stage lights. Lena Borden stood behind the curtain, her hands resting on her briefcase. Her chief of staff, Fiona Sailing, stood beside her, scrolling through notes on a tablet. The media is already framing the airport incident as a symbol of systemic bias, Fiona said, her voice low and efficient. It's trending under Justice for All. The press room is packed. Lena nodded, her expression unreadable. That wasn't the story I intended to tell, but perhaps it's the one people need to hear. Fiona glanced at her. You're prepared for the questions then? I'm always prepared, Lena replied, her voice steady. The MC, a seasoned senator with a commanding presence, stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. The room fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. It is my honor to introduce a trailblazer in justice reform, a voice for equity, and our newly appointed Attorney General of the United States, Lena Borden. Applause erupted, thunderous and heartfelt. Lena adjusted her blazer, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the stage. The applause swelled as she approached the podium, her presence commanding respect and admiration. She paused, scanning the room, her gaze sharp and discerning. When the applause subsided, she leaned into the microphone. Thank you, she began, her voice calm but resonant. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on a subject that defines not just my career, but my purpose. Her words settled over the audience like a blanket, drawing them in. She placed her hands on the podium, her fingers steady, her posture unyielding. Today, I was reminded of the very issues that bring us here, she said, her tone measured. As I traveled to this summit, I experienced firsthand the insidious nature of prejudice, how it operates in the shadows of assumptions, how it festers in the hearts of those who wield authority without accountability. The room grew tense, the silence heavy with expectation. At the airport this morning, I was detained for what they called improper paperwork. But let's be honest, that was a euphemism for something far more troubling. I was detained because I did not fit someone's idea of who deserves respect. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by murmurs of outrage. Lena let the noise simmer before continuing. I share this not to point fingers, but to illuminate a broader truth. Bias, whether implicit or explicit, does not exist in isolation. It is woven into the very fabric of our institutions. It manifests in boardrooms, courtrooms, classrooms, and, yes, even in airports. Her voice grew stronger, her cadence deliberate. But we cannot afford to be complacent. Justice is not a passive ideal, it is an active pursuit. And it starts with acknowledging that the systems we trust are not immune to the flaws of the individuals who operate them. Applause erupted again, but Lena raised her hand gently, signaling for quiet. We are here today to discuss justice reform, but let us not forget that reform begins with accountability. It begins with holding ourselves to a higher standard, not just as individuals, but as a society. Lena leaned forward, her voice lowering to draw the audience closer. Each of you in this room holds a piece of the solution. You are policymakers, advocates, and enforcers of the law. You have the power to dismantle the barriers that perpetuate inequality. But that power is meaningless without action. Her gaze swept the room, landing on each section with deliberate intensity. The question is, will you use it? The weight of her words lingered for a moment. The room was utterly silent. Then, like a wave crashing onto the shore, applause roared through the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, their energy electric. As Lena stepped off the stage, Fiona was there to greet her, a look of quiet pride on her face. That was incredible, she said. You didn't just speak, you galvanized them. Lena gave a small smile, but her mind was already moving forward. The real work begins now. That was the easy part. Fiona handed her a tablet. The press conference is next. They're going to want details about the airport incident. Lena frowned slightly. We'll give them what they need to push the conversation forward, but I won't let it overshadow the larger message. This isn't about me. It's about the system. Fiona nodded. Understood. I've already drafted a response. Take a look. Lena skimmed the document as they walked toward the press room. The words were concise, powerful, and unapologetic. She handed the tablet back to Fiona with a curt nod. Let's do this. The press room was packed, reporters jostling for position. As Lena took her seat at the front of the room, cameras flashed, and the air buzzed with questions. One reporter stood and fired the first question. Miss Borden, can you comment on the incident at the airport? How do you feel about being treated that way as the Attorney General? Lena's expression didn't waver. It was a stark reminder of why the work we do is so important. My experience was uncomfortable, but it pales in comparison to what countless others endure daily, without the privilege of a platform or title. Another reporter jumped in. What actions will you take to address these issues moving forward? Lena leaned forward, her voice steady and deliberate. We will hold institutions accountable. We will push for policies that ensure equity and fairness at every level. And we will not stop until justice is not just a concept, but a reality for all. The questions continued, and Lena fielded each one with the precision of a seasoned advocate. By the time the press conference ended, she had transformed what could have been a personal grievance into a rallying cry for systemic change. As the day wound down, Lena returned to her hotel, exhausted but resolute. She flipped on the television, and there it was, her speech, her press conference, her words echoing across networks and social media platforms. The headlines read, Attorney General calls out systemic bias in powerful summit address. Lena Borden turns personal incident into call for national reform. She turned off the TV, leaning back in her chair. The journey ahead was long, but for the first time that day, she allowed herself a moment of pride. She hadn't just survived the day's challenges. She'd turned them into a stepping stone for justice. The fight was far from over, but Lena Borden was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Lena's hotel suite, illuminating the sleek, modern decor. Lena sat at the small breakfast table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, her tablet propped in front of her. The headlines were still ablaze with yesterday's events. Every major news outlet featured her story, each one emphasizing the audacity of what had happened at the airport and the power of her response at the summit. Social media was aflame with hashtags like Justice for All, Lena Speaks, and No Systemic Bias. Lena scrolled through the articles, her expression thoughtful. Each headline felt like a double-edged sword. The attention was necessary to spark change, but it also risked reducing the larger issue to a singular moment, a spectacle rather than a movement. Fiona entered the room, her energy as sharp as ever. She carried a stack of documents and a laptop. Good morning, she said briskly, setting her things on the table. I just got off the phone with the White House. The president wants to meet with you this afternoon to discuss expanding the agenda for reform. Lena raised an eyebrow. Expanding it. How? Fiona sat down and opened her laptop. They're proposing a task force to address implicit bias in federal agencies. They want you to lead it. Lena sipped her coffee, letting the information sink in. That's a significant step. It is, Fiona agreed, but it's also going to put you under an even brighter spotlight. Every move you make will be scrutinized. Lena set her cup down, her gaze steady. Let them scrutinize. If it forces the issue into the public consciousness, then it's worth it. Before Lena could delve further into the day's agenda, there was a knock at the door. Fiona frowned, checking her watch. You weren't expecting anyone, were you? No, Lena said, standing to answer the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by an unexpected sight. Sarah Ballman, the airport director, standing there with a look of earnest determination. She held a folder in her hands and appeared slightly out of breath. Miss Borden, I'm sorry to show up unannounced, Sarah said quickly, but I needed to speak with you. Lena stepped aside to let her in, curiosity piqued. Director Ballman, what brings you here? Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the suite. She looked around nervously before speaking. I wanted to thank you again for how you handled the situation yesterday, and I also wanted to share something with you. She handed Lena the folder. Inside was a stack of documents, including emails, reports, and what appeared to be internal complaints. Lena skimmed the first few pages, her eyes narrowing as she read. These are internal records from the airport, Sarah explained. After what happened yesterday, I started digging. It turns out Carl Kinnett's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. He's been accused of racial profiling multiple times, but those complaints were buried by my predecessor. Lena looked up sharply. Buried? Sarah nodded, guilt shadowing her features. I didn't know about them until now, but I take full responsibility for the culture that allowed it to continue. I wanted you to have these records because I know you can do something with them. Lena closed the folder, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Carl Kinnett. It was a systemic issue entrenched in the airport's operations. Thank you for bringing this to me, she said finally. But what about you? What are you going to do about it? Sarah's eyes hardened with resolve. I've already initiated a full audit of our policies and procedures. Carl Kinnett is under investigation, and I've reopened the old complaints. There will be accountability. Lena studied Sarah for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Keep me updated. Sarah exhaled, relief evident in her posture. I will. Thank you for giving me the chance to make this right. As Sarah left, Fiona looked at Lena expectantly. What are you thinking? Lena tapped the folder thoughtfully. I'm thinking this just became bigger than I anticipated. That afternoon, Lena found herself in the Oval Office, seated across from the president and a small group of advisors. The president, a seasoned politician with a reputation for pragmatism, leaned forward, his expression serious. Lena, he began, what happened to you at the airport was unacceptable, but it also highlights a broader issue that we need to address, not just in airports, but across every federal institution. Lena nodded, her posture composed. I agree, Mr. President. We can't allow incidents like this to go unchecked. It undermines public trust in the very systems we're supposed to protect. The president gestured to one of his advisors, who handed Lena a folder. This is our initial proposal for the task force. We wanted to focus on identifying and addressing implicit bias in hiring, training, and day-to-day operations within federal agencies. Lena flipped through the proposal, noting its scope and ambitious timeline. This is a solid start, she said, but it needs teeth. A task force without enforcement mechanisms will only produce recommendations that gather dust. The president smiled slightly, clearly appreciating her candor. That's why we want you to lead it. You have the vision and the authority to push this through. Lena set the folder down, meeting his gaze. If I'm going to do this, I need assurances, full transparency, access to resources, and a mandate to hold people accountable, no matter their rank. The president nodded. You'll have it. By the time Lena returned to her hotel, the weight of the day was beginning to settle on her shoulders. She sat by the window, looking out at the city skyline, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The task force was a monumental responsibility, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to make tangible changes. Still, the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. The spotlight would grow brighter, the scrutiny more intense. But Lena was ready. As she picked up the folder Sarah had given her, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work was just beginning, and she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or judged unfairly. She opened her laptop and began drafting her plan, the words flowing with purpose and clarity. Lena Borden wasn't just responding to injustice. She was leading the charge against it. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The morning was quiet, the kind of calm that hinted at a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Lena Borden sat at her desk in the Justice Department's headquarters, the early sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting sharp lines across the room. Stacks of reports, case files, and the controversial folder Sarah Ballman had given her were spread out before her like a battlefield. She stared at them, her coffee cooling beside her, and felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about one man, one airport, or even one system. It was about dismantling the deeply ingrained biases that had infected every corner of the institutions meant to serve and protect. Lena's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Fiona entered, her tablet clutched in one hand, her expression a mix of urgency and focus. "They've released their first rebuttal," she said, sliding the tablet across the desk. "Carl Kinnett's attorney is claiming you overreacted and that this is a smear campaign against his client." Lena picked up the tablet, her eyes scanning the headlines. "Airport employee accuses Attorney General of exploiting her power for personal gain." The accompanying article was laced with insinuations, painting Carl as a victim of a political agenda. Lena's jaw tightened. "So, he's playing the victim." Fiona nodded. "It's predictable, but dangerous. They're framing this as a misuse of authority on your part, trying to shift the narrative." Lena set the tablet down. "Let them. The facts are on our side." An hour later, Lena convened a meeting with her inner circle, a team of sharp legal minds and communication strategists. They gathered in the conference room, a modern space lined with screens displaying charts, statistics, and news coverage. "We need to get ahead of this," Fiona began, standing at the head of the table. "Carl Kinnett's legal team is trying to muddy the waters. If we don't respond decisively, this could spiral." Lena leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "The response has to be strategic. This isn't about defending me. It's about exposing the systemic issues that allowed his behavior to continue unchecked." One of the advisors, a seasoned attorney named Jonah Clark, spoke up. "We have Sarah Ballman's records. They're damning, but if we release them, we'll be accused of targeting an individual rather than addressing the broader problem." "That's because the broader problem doesn't want to be addressed," Lena replied. "But we're not going to let that stop us. Release the records, but tie them to a larger narrative. Show that this isn't just about Carl Kinnett. It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchallenged for too long." Fiona nodded, taking notes. "We can frame it as part of the task force's initial findings. That will keep the focus on the larger issue." "Good," Lena said. "But we also need to be prepared for the backlash. This isn't just about bias, it's about power. And people will fight to protect it." By noon, the Justice Department had released a public statement, alongside the records Sarah had provided. The media response was immediate and explosive. Headlines shifted from personal accusations against Lena to broader investigations into systemic racial profiling at federal facilities. Social media was a battleground, with hashtags like Justice for All and Expose the Bias trending alongside posts defending Carl Kinnett and accusing Lena of overreach. The divide was stark, with supporters praising Lena's courage and detractors accusing her of using her position for personal vendettas. Lena watched the news coverage from her office, her face calm, but her mind sharp. She knew this was only the beginning. Her phone buzzed. It was Sarah Ballman. "I just saw the news," Sarah said, her voice a mix of nerves and determination. "You're really doing it. You're shining a light on all of it." "This isn't about shining a light," Lena replied. "It's about making sure the shadows don't come back." Sarah hesitated. "Carl's legal team is going to come after me for releasing those records." "You did the right thing," Lena assured her. "And you're not alone in this. We'll protect you." Sarah's voice softened. "Thank you. For everything." Later that afternoon, Lena received an unexpected visitor. Carl Kinnett himself had arrived at the Justice Department, flanked by his attorney. They demanded a meeting, and against Fiona's protests, Lena agreed. In the sterile conference room, Carl sat across from Lena, his attorney beside him. His once arrogant demeanor was replaced by a calculated indignation. "You've destroyed my reputation," Carl said, his voice low and accusing. "All because of a misunderstanding at the airport." Lena met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern of behavior that you've engaged in for years, unchecked and unchallenged." Carl's attorney leaned forward. You have no proof of any malicious intent. This is nothing more than a political witch hunt. Lena placed a folder on the table, sliding it toward them. The proof is right here. Complaints filed by passengers, witnesses, even your colleagues. This isn't about politics. It's about accountability. Carl's face flushed, but his attorney quickly took the folder, flipping through it. This doesn't prove bias. It's circumstantial at best. Lena leaned forward, her voice firm. You can spin this however you like, but the truth is already out there. And the truth doesn't need your approval. The tension in the room was palpable. Carl's attorney stood, signaling the end of the meeting. This isn't over. Lena's gaze didn't waver. You're right. It's just beginning. As the days unfolded, the firestorm continued to grow. Public opinion was fiercely divided, but the task force gained momentum. Lena received calls from civil rights organizations, lawmakers, and community leaders, all offering support. The conversation was shifting, and for the first time in years, there was a real possibility of change. But with progress came pushback. Anonymous threats began arriving at Lena's office, and smear campaigns targeted her personal life. Fiona insisted on increasing security, but Lena refused to be intimidated. This isn't just a battle, Lena said one evening, staring out of her office window at the city lights. It's a war, and wars aren't won without sacrifice. Fiona stood beside her, silent for a moment before speaking. Then we'll make sure every sacrifice is worth it. Lena turned to her, a determined fire in her eyes. We will. Because this isn't about me. It's about every person who's been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked. And I won't stop until their voices are heard. The battle lines were drawn, and Lena Borden was ready to fight, not for herself, but for justice for all. The next few weeks unfolded like a storm, each day bringing new challenges and heightened stakes. Lena's work as Attorney General had already drawn scrutiny, but now the focus on her was laser-sharp. The pressure wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Every decision, every public statement, and every private conversation seemed to echo in the media and public discourse. Her mornings started earlier, her nights ended later, and the phone calls never ceased. Fiona had doubled her security detail, much to Lena's annoyance. She couldn't so much as step outside her office without 2 agents shadowing her every move. But Lena knew the real battle wasn't in her office or even in the media. It was in the hearts and minds of the public. One morning, Fiona burst into Lena's office, her face pale and her tablet in hand. Lena, you need to see this. Lena glanced up, sensing the urgency. Fiona placed the tablet on her desk, showing a freshly published article from a well-known conservative news outlet. Attorney General's Hidden Agenda. Lena Borden, Attorney General's Hidden Agenda. Lena Borden's radical past exposed. The article was filled with thinly veiled attacks, accusing Lena of being an activist disguised as a public servant. It dug into her college years, twisting her involvement in social justice movements into something sinister. It even targeted her family, questioning their influence on her ideals. Lena's lips tightened as she scrolled through the article. They're grasping at straws, she said calmly, but they're dangerous straws. Fiona sat down across from her, her expression grave. This isn't just about discrediting you. It's about delegitimizing the entire reform movement. If they can paint you as a radical, they can discredit everything we're trying to achieve. Lena leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Let them come. My record speaks for itself, but we need to control the narrative. Fiona nodded. I'll set up an interview, a major network. We need to show people the real you, not the caricature they're creating. 2 days later, Lena sat across from one of the most respected journalists in the country, Gloria Mace, in a sleek television studio. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, and the stakes impossibly high. Madam Attorney General, Gloria began, her voice steady but probing. You've faced significant criticism in recent weeks, particularly regarding the airport incident and the subsequent task force. Some are calling your actions a misuse of power. How do you respond to that? Lena met Gloria's gaze, her expression calm but resolute. I understand the criticism, but I reject the premise. Accountability is not a misuse of power. It's the very essence of leadership. If we don't address systemic issues head-on, we allow them to fester, and I refuse to let that happen. Gloria nodded, shifting to the next question. Your detractors have also pointed to your past activism as evidence of bias. How do you reconcile your role as an impartial enforcer of the law with your history of advocacy? Lena leaned forward slightly, her tone thoughtful but firm. Advocacy and justice are not mutually exclusive. My past is a testament to my commitment to fairness and equity. Those experiences shaped me, but they don't cloud my judgment. They enhance it. They give me the perspective needed to ensure that the law serves everyone, not just a privileged few. The interview continued, each question more probing than the last, but Lena held her ground, her words measured and her resolve unshakable. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, she had turned the narrative on its head, reclaiming the story with grace and authority. The interview aired that evening, and the response was immediate. Social media lit up with hashtags like Lena Speaks Truth and Leadership in Action, with many praising her composure and clarity. Even some of her critics grudgingly admitted that she had handled the questions with skill and integrity. Fiona called her that night, her voice brimming with excitement. Lena, the numbers are in. Public support for the task force has surged by 15% since the interview. Whatever they tried to do, it backfired. Lena allowed herself a small smile. Good. But this isn't about numbers. It's about keeping the momentum. The following week, as Lena prepared for another meeting with the task force, she received an unexpected visitor, Senator Frank Marin, a prominent and influential figure from the opposing party. Marin was known for his staunch resistance to reform efforts, making his appearance in Lena's office both surprising and significant. Senator Marin, Lena greeted him, masking her surprise with professionalism. What brings you here? Marin removed his hat, a rare gesture of humility, and sat down across from her. I came to talk, not to argue. Lena raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing him to continue. I've been following your work, Marin admitted, his voice gruff but sincere. And while we don't see eye to eye on everything, I can't deny that you've brought attention to issues that need addressing. Lena leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. And what does that mean for today's conversation? It means I'm willing to work with you, Marin said, his tone deliberate, but only if you're willing to compromise. Lena studied him, her mind racing. She knew Marin's influence could open doors, but she also knew his definition of compromise might come at a cost. What kind of compromise are we talking about? She asked, her voice careful. Marin smirked, as if he'd expected the question. Nothing that undermines the heart of what you're doing. Just a few concessions to make it more palatable for folks on my side of the aisle. Lena's gaze didn't waver. I'm open to collaboration, Senator, but not at the expense of justice. Marin nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. Fair enough. Let's see what we can build together. The weeks that followed were relentless. Meetings with lawmakers, community leaders, and federal agency heads filled Lena's days, while late nights were spent poring over reports and refining the task force's proposals. The noise outside criticism, praise, threats never stopped, but Lena had learned to let it fade into the background, focusing instead on the work that mattered. The pivotal moment came on a crisp Friday morning. The Justice Department's auditorium was packed with reporters, activists, and policymakers. Cameras lined the back of the room, their lenses trained on the podium. Today, Lena would unveil the task force's first set of recommendations. Fiona stood beside her backstage, adjusting her earpiece. The room's full, and we're live on every major network, she said, her voice calm but tinged with excitement. It's your moment, Lena. Lena glanced at her, then at the stack of papers in her hands. It's not about me, Fiona. It's about them, all the people who've been waiting for change. Fiona smiled. Then let's give them what they've been waiting for. When Lena stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. She placed her notes on the podium, her gaze sweeping across the audience. Good morning, she began, her voice steady. Today marks the beginning of a journey toward accountability, equity, and justice. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. For too long, our institutions have operated under the assumption that bias is inevitable, that inequity is an unfortunate but unchangeable reality. But I reject that assumption. We reject that assumption. The audience erupted into applause, but Lena raised her hand, signaling for quiet. The task force I was entrusted to lead has spent weeks examining the systems that govern our nation. What we found was sobering but not surprising. Bias, both implicit and explicit, exists at every level. And while this truth is uncomfortable, acknowledging it is the first step toward change. She flipped to the next page of her notes. Today, I'm proud to present the first set of recommendations from the task force. These include mandatory implicit bias training for all federal employees, the creation of an independent oversight body to investigate claims of discrimination, and a comprehensive review of hiring and promotion practices across all agencies. The applause was louder this time, filled with genuine enthusiasm. Lena continued, her voice rising with conviction. These are not just policies, they are promises. Promises to the people of this country that their government will do better, promises that justice will not be a privilege, but a right. The press conference was a resounding success. Reporters bombarded Lena with questions, but she handled each one with the composure and clarity that had become her hallmark. By the end of the day, the headlines reflected the significance of what had transpired. Attorney General Lena Borden takes bold steps toward justice reform. A vision for change. Task force recommendations signal a new era. Lena Borden's leadership sets the stage for systemic overhaul. Fiona met Lena back at her office that evening, a rare smile lighting up her face. "You did it," she said simply. Lena leaned back in her chair, exhaustion and satisfaction washing over her. "We did it. But this is just the beginning." That night, alone in her apartment, Lena sat on the balcony, a glass of wine in her hand. The city skyline stretched before her, its lights twinkling against the dark canvas of the sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the struggles, the sacrifices, the victories. Her mind wandered to the faces of those who had supported her, those who had doubted her, and those who had tried to tear her down. Each one had played a role in shaping her path, and while the road ahead remained uncertain, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lena closed her eyes, inhaling the crisp night air. This wasn't just about policies or politics. It was about people, about building a world where justice wasn't an aspiration, but a reality. As she opened her eyes, she whispered to herself, a quiet promise to those she served. "We're not done yet." The months that followed saw the implementation of the task force's recommendations. There were setbacks, compromises, and battles yet to be won, but progress was undeniable. Lena Borden became a symbol of resilience and determination, her leadership inspiring a new generation of advocates and leaders. Carl Kennett's name faded from the headlines, his attempts to fight back drowned out by the tide of change. Sarah Ballman became a key ally in pushing for reform within federal facilities, her own journey a testament to the power of accountability. And Lena, she continued to fight, not for recognition, but for the countless people whose stories had fueled her mission. Her legacy wasn't just written in laws or policies, but in the lives she touched and the barriers she broke. Justice was no longer a distant dream. It was a work in progress, and Lena Borden was determined to see it through to the end.